Yes, yes, what you saying? Hope you're well. Welcome back to my series about investigative journalist James O'Keefe and the organisation he runs, Project Veritas. In the last video, we talked about how Project Veritas were able to form strategic partnerships with the inner circle of Trump's presidential campaign, and in doing so, propelled themselves from being an outsider activist group to one of the leading lights of the Republican media landscape. In this vid, we're going to talk about what came next after Trump's election. And doing so will involve recounting the events surrounding an unfortunate encounter between James O'Keefe and the Washington Post, and we'll then move on to analysing some of James's investigations of big tech companies such as Twitter, Facebook and Google, which have dominated Project Veritas' output over the last few years. Aight, let's do it.
I would sue you. You do it again, and I will.
The year is 2017. Donald Trump is coming to the end of his first year in office, and a special election has been declared in Alabama. This election is taking place outside of the usual midterm season because its purpose is to fill the Senate seat left vacant by Jeff Sessions, who has been newly appointed US Attorney General by President Trump at the start of the year. Alabama is a deeply red state, which Trump won by a comfortable margin in 2016, so there isn't too much trepidation amongst GOP members about losing Senate power here. However, the battle to win the GOP runoff produces an interesting conflict within the Republican Party. Mainstream conservative insider Luther Strange is the candidate most favoured to win by the GOP establishment, whilst horse-riding, Bible-thumping dogmatist Roy Moore has mass support amongst Christian evangelicals. Something people often forget was that this was a primary where Trump had his thumb on the scale. He threw his support fully behind the establishment pick, Luther Strange. Big Luther is a great guy who gets things done. Alabama is so lucky to have a candidate like Big Luther Strange. Alabama Republicans ignore Donald Trump and opt instead for Bible-thumping Roy Moore. So the whole of the GOP, including Trump, recalibrates its messaging to revolve around Roy Moore being the greatest, most patriotic, winningest guy that has ever lived, and definitely the best guy to run Alabama. But then, on November 9th, 2 months ahead of the election, the Washington Post reports an allegation from Lee Kaufman that Roy Moore initiated a sexual encounter with her in 1979 when she was just 14 years old. The report sets off a domino effect whereby 8 more women end up coming forward with stories of their own about Roy Moore's unwanted sexual advances. Immediately, we see a binary split in perception forming between Democrats and Republicans. To Democrat voters, the fact that 9 women were accusing Roy Moore of sexual assault constituted proof the allegations were credible, whereas to Republican voters, this felt a lot like a political hit job, and a not insignificant amount of people saw the women involved in the allegations as liars and opportunists.
How many women have to come forward before you say, wait a minute, where there's smoke, there's fire?
It doesn't matter about it's the legitimacy, not just how many.
Exactly.
How many are actually not being paid or being coerced to do this?
How many of them do you think are being paid?
All of them.
All of them?
All of them.
For many GOP voters, even ones who saw merit to the Roy Moore allegations, policy was the strongest motivating reason to vote, and so many were willing to begrudgingly do so for Roy Moore regardless of the credibility of what was being said about him. However, the GOP party still had a problem with floating Alabama voters who might well be put off at Roy Moore's alleged history of misconduct, and there was no clear way out of this particular quandary. Apart from if the newspaper reporting the sexual assault allegations, i.e. the Washington Post, could be discredited. Beth Reinhart was one of the journalists at the Washington Post who wrote the Roy Moore story, and literally hours after she published her article, she received an email from an anonymous source with the subject line, Roy Moore in AL. The email said,
Roy Moore in Alabama. I might know something, but I need to keep myself safe. How do we do this?
Beth wrote an email back asking if the person would be willing to talk off the record. The reply she got back was,
Not sure if I trust the phone. Can we just stick to email?
and then in a subsequent message, the source wrote,
I need to be confident that you can protect me before I will tell all. I have stuff I've been hiding for a long time, but maybe it should stay that way.
Beth started communicating with the source via an encrypted text messaging service. The source eventually gave a name, Jamie Phillips. Jamie lived in New York, but she'd be visiting Washington during Thanksgiving week and was happy to meet with Beth in a local shopping mall for a conversation. Jamie was a middle-aged woman, long red hair, nicely dressed. She opens up about her childhood and says she was abused as a child. She'd moved around a lot and had ended up living with her aunt in the Talladega area of Alabama, where she attended a church youth group. It was here that she first came into contact with Roy Moore, who was 45 years old. Jamie was only 15 years old. Roy Moore, the 45-year-old man, initiated a secret sexual relationship with Jamie. Even more disturbingly, she fell pregnant as a result, and she wanted to keep the baby. But Roy Moore talked her into having an abortion and drove her all the way to Mississippi to get one. Jamie said she'd kept silent about her sexual abuse all these years, but started thinking about it again when the Washington Post published their story about Roy Moore's accusers. It was at this point that the conversation took a bit of a strange turn. Jamie said to Beth that she was disgusted with President Trump for endorsing Roy Moore, and asked whether Beth could guarantee her that she could make Roy Moore lose the election by coming forward with her story. This seemed strange to Beth, as when sexual abuse victims came forward, they were rarely motivated by specific strategic outcomes. It's more typically that they felt their stories needed to be heard, regardless of what happened in the aftermath. Multiple times, Jamie hammered on this point that she needed a verbal guarantee of Roy Moore's campaign being destroyed, and Beth advised her in a subsequent text message that she could not predict what the impact of Jamie coming forward would be. It was up to Jamie to decide whether or not she wanted to come forward. Jamie then became angry when Beth asked her for documents which could corroborate her story.
I feel anxiety and negative energy after our meeting. You just didn't convince me that I should come forward.
In response to Jamie, Beth said, "I'm so sorry, but I want to be straight with you about the fact-checking process and the fact that we can't guarantee what will happen as a result of another story." And Jamie responded back,
I'd rather go to another paper than talk to you again.
It looked like Beth wouldn't be getting this story after all. But there was something about Jamie that had seemed very off. Beth started looking into the details of Jamie's story, and bit by bit, she started uncovering things that didn't add up. Jamie had a Twitter page with the profile picture "Love Not Hate Makes America Great," and a Facebook account with the banner photo of John F. Kennedy, but both accounts had only been created in the last 6 months. Beth's fact-checking of Jamie's story led to some more interesting findings. Jamie said she lived in New York, but the phone number she provided had an Alabama area code. Jamie also claimed that she worked at NFM Lending, but when Beth called that company up, they said they didn't have an office in Westchester County and nobody named Jamie Phillips worked there. However, the real red flag was uncovered by another reporter at the Washington Post called Alice Kreitz, who came across a GoFundMe page which had been created by someone called Jamie Phillips.
I'm moving to New York. I've accepted a job to work in the conservative media movement to combat the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM. I'll be using my skills as a researcher and fact-checker to help our movement. I was laid off from my mortgage job a few months ago and came across the opportunity to change my career path. The timing of being laid off and then being presented with the chance to finally do some good in this world all came together at just the right moment. Because of my recent layoff, however, I'm in need of funding and sponsorship for me to be able to make this big life change.
The real Jamie Phillips was a woman devoted to Donald Trump. She owned a Twitter account with the handle Jamie Loves President Trump and a fawning photo tribute to the president in her profile banner. She posted about things like fake news at CNN, she interacted with quite a few of Trump's media lapdogs, and she posted mocking videos of the Women's March in Washington, D.C. In the following days, a Washington Post reporter would station themselves in a car park at Westchester County and observe Jamie Phillips walking straight through the front door of Project Veritas headquarters.
Veritas is in the process of hiring 12 more undercover reporters, recruiting at ProjectVeritas.com. If you're listening to this broadcast and you want to do what we do, I will pay you to go undercover.
Jamie had been paid by James O'Keefe to lie that Roy Moore sexually abused her as a child, lie that Roy Moore impregnated her, and lie that Roy Moore had forced her to get an abortion. The whole thing was a complete fabrication. The reason why Jamie had been repeatedly asking Beth to guarantee her verbally that Roy Moore would lose the election was because Jamie was wearing a hidden camera recording the meeting and following the Project Veritas script so she could get useful soundbites for James. After engineering this conversation, James O'Keefe's plan was to use the soundbites to discredit the Washington Post and the women who Roy Moore had allegedly abused when they were as young as 14, in order to give Republicans the fuel they needed to decry all allegations as fake and get Roy Moore elected. Not realizing that the Washington Post had rumbled her, Jamie arranged a follow-up meeting with another reporter called Stephanie McCruman. Stephanie recorded the entirety of the conversation on audio.
Hi, are you Jamie?
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So Stephanie walks in and Jamie is already there waiting for her.
Yeah.
Stephanie purposefully puts her bag down right next to Jamie's, obscuring the view of any hidden cameras Jamie might have. But then Jamie instantly moves her bag out the way. So it's obvious she's recording Stephanie using a hidden camera in her bag.
Now Beth has told me a little bit about your conversations and your, texting back and forth.
Yeah.
But I thought it was probably best just, to sort of, I want to hear your story and just, start from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I did tell her like the outline and like just the general. Like I told her stuff about my life, like growing up, and it was almost like it felt like she just like didn't care at all. So I don't know, I just felt really weird about it. And I'm just not sure. I mean, maybe it's not the right fit with the Washington Post. I don't know.
Well, like I said, Beth told me a little bit about what you talked about. So if you want to just, I'm here to listen.
Well, I really don't like today. I mean, maybe like the next time we meet, we can like hash it out some more. But I mean, really today, I wanted to really hear more from you in particular, like about like where you see the story going and what kind of an impact and things like that.
Yeah.
So because I just don't feel convinced yet that it's even the right thing for me to do.
Right.
Notice the way that Jamie's trying to apply pressure to Stephanie here, much like a negotiator closing a sale. Jamie has something the Washington Post wants, her sexual abuse story, and Jamie's threatening to take it elsewhere if she doesn't get the verbal reassurance she needs. In this next bit of audio, she's going to criticize Beth, the reporter who tried to fact-check her, and this is to preemptively deter Stephanie from doing the same thing.
So she was telling me a lot about like the process and the background and the fact-checking, and that stuff's not really, like that doesn't even really bother me, like that's not even really a concern to me. My biggest concern is like coming forward for no reason and having my name published and then having it be for no reason, so
Well, it's really, it's your decision.
I mean, I just have seen like what's happening with these other women, and that's because nothing's happening. Like even today, I saw this morning on the news that Trump like literally endorsed this guy.
Bear in mind, Jamie is participating in a scheme to purposefully discredit alleged sexual abuse victims on behalf of Donald Trump's political movement. Following the Project Veritas script, Jamie repeatedly voices anxiety to try and coax Stephanie into saying something comforting to her, which James O'Keefe can then use to frame the Washington Post as having an agenda against Roy Moore.
My whole thing is like, I want him to be completely taken out of the race. And I really expected that was going to happen, and now it's not. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that the starting point really is to hear your story. So maybe if we could just.
He would just kind of like, at first, just kind of like be really affectionate towards me and things like that. So, and it just kind of like went on from there. But I mean, like, I'm just not really comfortable getting into all the details.
Yeah.
Because I still just don't know if I want to even do the story. So I just feel like these other women are just like being discredited. It feels like people aren't believing them and all that stuff, and I just don't want to go through that.
Well, what I can tell you is that, one thing that we always do as a starting point, and any good reporter would do this, it's just a standard operating procedure, is that we like to, basically know who we're talking to and, document that.
Yeah.
And so, so kind of that, there are different ways to do it. And one of the kind of easiest ways to do it is just to see something like a driver's license. Do you happen to have an ID like that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Jamie hands over her driving license for Stephanie to check, and it confirms that her real name is Jamie Phillips, matching the GoFundMe page which the Washington Post uncovered. The audio you're about to hear is Stephanie pulling a printout of the GoFundMe page from her folder and putting it on the table to show Jamie.
As part of, also sort of our research process, and we have, as Beth explained, we have a process of doing background, checking backgrounds and this kind of thing. And so, so I wanted to ask you about one thing, and so we're just doing sort of a background check, and we came across this. This is a GoFundMe page, which has your name on it, Jamie Phillips.
Yeah.
And it has also, let's see, where was that? It lists somewhere a donation from the person that you said was your child, Taylor. And it says that you're moving to New York, and that you've accepted a job to work in the conservative media movement to combat the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM. I'll be using my skills as a researcher and fact checker to help our movement.
This is the point where two other journalists from the Washington Post position themselves at a nearby table in the cafe with a hidden camera, and so we see video kick in.
So I just wanted to ask you if you could explain this, and I also wanted to let you know, Jamie, that this is being recorded and video recorded.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking to take a job last summer in New York, but it fell through. So I ended up not taking the job.
Okay. So, but you were interested in doing this job? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was going to be with the Daily Caller.
And what was your interest in working for the Daily Caller?
I like their stories. And I thought that I would be good at doing research and stuff like that.
And so who was the person that you interviewed with?
It was a lady named Kathy.
What was her last name?
Johnson.
Kathy Johnson.
But I don't know why we are going into all this yet.
Well,
I haven't even agreed to go through with the story yet.
You can just imagine what must be going through Jamie's head at this moment. She's lied to a national newspaper that a state senator sexually abused her and impregnated her as a child. Also, James O'Keefe can pull a trick on the Washington Post. She's probably thinking, have I committed a crime? Can I be sent to jail for this? Oh my God.
Do you still have an interest in, as this says, combating the lies and deceit of the liberal MSM? Is that still your interest?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Not at this point.
No.
I don't really want to get into any more details about my life because I mean, it's obvious that you're not believing me, so I don't really see the point of even continuing the meeting.
Yeah.
So I probably should just cancel the whole thing.
Okay. Well, if there's anything, if there's anything you want to say for the record, we're, like I said, we're planning to write a story. Your name will be, probably could be in the story. So if you want to explain, this is your chance to explain. Well, we're all on the record, as I said, and this is you. But this is your chance now if you want to really explain this. I mean it.
I mean, I explain. So, I mean, I haven't agreed to go on the record at all.
Yeah.
So.
When the tables are turned on Jamie, she withdraws from being a bullish negotiator, threatening Stephanie that she's going to retract her story unless she gets the sound bites she needs, and she transforms into this wilting flower, desperately trying to get herself off the hook for the lies she's told. To me, there's something deeply shameful about the way that when we get to this moment where Jamie has been found out, she appeals to the sanctity of the off-the-record agreement she made with Stephanie. If Jamie hadn't been found out, she would have taken the footage from this meeting and used it to literally destroy Stephanie's career. She wouldn't have thought twice about doing that. That was her plan. And yet now that the spotlight is on her, it's the relationship of trust that she tries to cling to. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? James has all these ways of rationalizing what his Project Veritas reporters do, and yet when those reporters receive the same treatment from others that they dish out all the time, look how mortified they are. Now, this encounter is informative in many ways, but there's one thing in particular I want to laser focus in on. James has a boilerplate argument which he always trots out to justify his journalistic methods, and it goes like this. Project Veritas deceives people in order to have an honest conversation with them and make them reveal their true selves.
You have to use deception to a degree. Either you deceive your source or you deceive your audience. So our undercovers draw people out by I guess, figuring out what they need, being that thing, right, and then having an honest conversation. It's not like I'm injecting my narrative or opinion in these videos. We're just showing people what people say when no one's looking.
James's argument is that the situation is manufactured, but the words spoken by the target are 100% authentic, straight from the person's brain. They're things the target would be saying every day, but James's reporters are just there in the room to catch them saying it. But looking at the way Jamie conducts the Washington Post sting, something she's clearly been prepped for by James, it's obvious that when James constructs this argument to justify Project Veritas's methods, he's not being honest. Jamie says she needs the reporters to verbally guarantee her that Roy Moore will go down. She says she needs the reporters to describe the impact her story will have. She needs reassurances that Donald Trump will be hurt by this. What we're witnessing here is Jamie following a script to put very specific words in the reporters' mouths. Say Roy Moore will go down, or I walk away. Say that my story will impact the Senate race, or I walk away. If the reporters had at any point placated Jamie by saying these words, James O'Keefe would have triumphantly pumped out the footage saying, look, they have an agenda to take Roy Moore down. They have an agenda to influence the Senate race. Here they are saying it. And James O'Keefe is himself engineering these conversations specifically to plant these quotes. Quotes which aren't representative of what the reporters would usually be saying to sexual abuse victims if they were left to their own devices.
It's not like I'm injecting my narrative or opinion in these videos. We're just showing people what people say when no one's looking. It's more reality. It's people in their own words. I'm not a ventriloquist.
When it was discovered that Jamie was working for Project Veritas, a Washington Post reporter went out to speak directly to James O'Keefe.
Hey, this is a reporter of the Washington Post. Hey, how are you? How you doing?
Aaron Davis.
Hey, I was just invite
No, I don't think so. Thank you very much, so have a great day.
Well, I have a question for you guys.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Well, here's the deal. So the other night, Wednesday night in Virginia, there was a woman who approached...
Do you like our techniques? Have you been inspired by Project Veritas?
To James O'Keefe, this on-the-street confrontation is possibly the most injurious thing the Washington Post could have done to him. A big part of the James O'Keefe and Project Veritas brand is a constant display of bravado and dominance over their political opponents. Project Veritas is something of a vanity project for James, and he always projects this strongman image. He wants Project Veritas viewers to think of him as powerful, dominant, ruthless, always looking ahead to the next victory over his opposition. By contrast, look at how James comes across here. A weak glass of milk. He laughs nervously, and he's unable to come up with anything to say back to the establishment journalist asking him questions.
Does Jamie Phillips work for Project Veritas? Did you guys send her to speak to pose as a victim of Roy Moore to the Washington Post?
I'm 15 minutes late for this meeting, so okay. I gotta run, but we will get in touch with you, okay?
I just want to make clear, if we report that this woman works at Project Veritas, do you dispute that?
I am not doing an interview right now, so
we're done.
I'm not going to say a word, okay?
The other person shown in this video, Robert Haldeman, is far more noticeably aggravated. He's actually famous in his own right outside of Project Veritas for trying to extort $2 million from popular TV show host David Letterman. He blackmailed Letterman with personal information he'd learned about Letterman's extramarital affair in 2009. In this video, Haldeman tries to defend James from being questioned by saying the line, "Here's the problem," a whole bunch of times.
Running to a meeting.
Someone approached the Washington Post reporter saying that she was impregnated by Roy Moore.
Here's the problem.
Was that truthful or was
Here's
that
the problem.
not?
The problem is we're busy. So if you'd like to make an appointment, please call our office to make an appointment.
Okay, I can do
Thank
that.
you.
After this encounter, the Washington Post reporter rings James O'Keefe as he'd been advised to schedule an appointment, and they agree a time for the interview. But when the reporter from the Post, Aaron Davis, shows up at Project Veritas headquarters, he finds James randomly in the parking lot.
So I'm glad we could talk finally, because I do have a few questions for you.
I'm here.
In anticipation.
I have the questions.
Okay.
I approached you earlier, so let me get a couple.
I have some questions too.
Well, let me get a couple questions off my chest first.
Well, actually,
this is a classic technique in investigative journalism called the reverse interview. It's when someone has damaged your ego, so you do this trick of agreeing to an interview, but then pretend that you are the interviewer.
There's something
the first one we need to know is does Jamie Phillips work for Project Veritas?
Let me ask you a question.
James O'Keefe spent the time between Washington Post confronting him in the morning and Washington Post turning up at the agreed interview time, working out a way that he could re-establish his dominance over his opposition and save his damaged ego. And this is what he came up with. He posted this video to Twitter with the caption, "The Washington Post sends a reporter to question me, but take a look. Who's interviewing who?" In this video, James employs a masterful strategy of waiting for the Washington Post reporter to ask a question, and then James ignores the question and asks his own question back.
Are you working with Roy Moore?
Okay.
Are you working with Steve Bannon?
I'm going to ask.
Are you working with the Republican Party?
No.
Are you working with the Republican Party of Alabama?
So here's what we're going to talk about.
Your project is Truth in Journalism, correct?
Are you done with your questions?
I am. Are you going to answer any of them?
I'm waiting for you to finish. You said you had a few things to say.
Those are my questions, and I'd like you to answer them.
All right. Well, I've got some questions.
And if you're not...
Here's how Project Veritas viewers react to this. Watching a Washington Post reporter retreat when faced with real journalism. Nice work, James. This is absolutely awesome, James. Must watch video. Way to go fighting back. So the Washington Post reporter eventually gets fed up and starts walking back to his car. And it's at this point that James O'Keefe drops a bombshell.
Can I ask you a question? Is the Washington Post ambushing me and confronting us because of what we're about to release? Is this a sort of anticipatory behavior ahead of what we're about to do? We think it's in anticipation of some things that are about to come out.
Oh my god, James O'Keefe has dirt on the Washington Post. At the time, people didn't know what dirt James had, but we know now. I'm gonna show it to you. It's a video of Washington Post correspondent Dan Lamoth saying that he thinks that Washington Post's opinion section is quite biased.
See, here's the thing though, there's the news side that's just trying to cover it critically, and then there's like the other side of it that's like, you know, the opinion from God, like the Washington Post institutional voice, and that's like the editorial. Those are become like critical to the point where I'll read some of them and I'm like, whew.
That's James O'Keefe's big scoop about the Washington Post, that their editorial section is tainted by editorial bias. Having a hidden camera was a very creative way of obtaining this scoop, but there's another way James could have done it. He could have gone to Google and typed in the word editorial and then scrolled down to the noun definition. It says, a newspaper article expressing the editor's opinion on a topical issue. I mean, having a guy on camera explaining this exact thing in a covertly recorded video is pretty cool, but you really didn't need to hide the camera. Any Washington Post reporter would have said this straight to your face. So, with the dramatics out the way, here's what I think actually happened. When James O'Keefe was confronted outside his office and realized he'd been rumbled by the Washington Post, he faced a dilemma. The establishment media now had very powerful evidence that James O'Keefe paid a woman to lie about being sexually abused as a child, coupled with footage of James meekly running away from an establishment journalist with his tail between his legs. It was a loss on two fronts, showing both the hollowness of the ethics James O'Keefe preached and also showing James being a massive pussy. So James O'Keefe thinks about what he can do to regain control of the narrative, and what has he got to work with? Well, not much, apart from a video of a junior Washington Post reporter who Jamie Phillips met at a conference. The course of action James ultimately decided to take was radical but simple. He would simply pretend that the video he had was the biggest story ever. Pretend that the Washington Post were only going after him because they were terrified of him broadcasting this huge story, and pretend all of this with such conviction that the pretense would become reality for his gullible viewers. You have to remember that Project Veritas viewers are so blinded by political ideology, partisanship, and their hate of the Washington Post that they didn't really need to see any substantial evidence of wrongdoing to swallow whatever narrative James was pushing down their throats. James's job was not to persuade them that he was in the right and that WAPO was in the wrong. They already believed this. James's job was just to give his fans some ammunition to rattle off in his defense if anyone brought up his journalistic and moral failings. One commenter, very tellingly, remarks that James has God on his side. And this is very revealing of how someone can rationalize their choice to believe a journalist who pays women to lie about being sexually abused as children. It's not the best optics, but then again, God works in mysterious ways. Who are you to doubt his plan for James O'Keefe? I want to direct you to James's website, where Project Veritas has published a list of their ethical values, and there's two in particular which I want to shine a spotlight on. First, rule number 10, being accountable. Admit mistakes and correct them promptly. So keep that one in your back pocket. And another rule which Project Veritas puts at the very top of its list is this one. Truth is paramount. We never deceive our audience. And James wants to make sure his audience knows this. He would never lie to them. If you read James's book, you'll see this point drilled multiple times. He says that what separates him from establishment journos is that James never deceives his audience. Like, says it over and over again.
You have a choice to make. You can either, from my perspective, deceive your audience, or you can, for lack of a better word, deceive the person that you're interviewing such that you can tell the truth to the audience. And telling the truth to the public is paramount. The public has a right to know this information.
Through his rhetoric, James creates a very reassuring narrative for his followers to believe in. James is a liar, but he will only ever lie for them. He will lie to other people on their behalf. He would never, ever turn his lies on them. With this in mind, listen to what James says at the start of his Washington Post retaliation video.
Today, the Washington Post is floundering. They're spending a ton of time and money trying to turn the tables on Project Veritas, talking about an imagined sting. But why are they so afraid? What are they so afraid of? What are they guarding against? Well, it turns out Project Veritas has done an undercover investigation into the Washington Post.
James tells his viewers that the Washington Post are wasting time talking about an imagined sting. These rules about admitting mistakes and never lying to Project Veritas viewers, they mean nothing. James takes no responsibility, he admits nothing, and he lies to his audience blatantly, absurdly. What a stupid, dumb lie that he's telling here. There's that saying, isn't there? If someone always talks about how they'll never lie to you, they're probably liars. They're probably lying to you all the time. James is a particularly disingenuous, unscrupulous liar, only too willing to pull the wool over his viewers' eyes as soon as it's the most politically expedient thing for him to do. In James's book, he writes that in almost every case where the media is exposed, the media finds some way not to address the issue. They often write off the evidence as some sort of nutty conspiracy and ignore it. Like, this is exactly what James is doing. Where is the self-awareness? In an interview on The Rubin Report 2 years after the sting in 2019, James O'Keefe mentioned it and claimed total ignorance of why the sting he orchestrated might be perceived as unethical.
There was one thing with the Washington Post that blew up. They turned their cameras back around on us, and everyone, said, well, that's unethical. Well, what exactly was unethical about it?
I actually find myself in something of a unique position here because since I released my third Project Veritas video, James O'Keefe is following me on Twitter, which I can only take to mean that he must be watching the series. If so, I can take this opportunity to speak directly to you and enlighten you on why the Washington Post sting could be viewed by some as unethical. So let's break it down. Firstly, falsely claiming that someone sexually abused you and impregnated you as a child. Now, some people might call this unethical because it cheapens the very real tragedy of people who were sexually abused as children. Many people live through exploitative situations, just like the one that you and Jamie Phillips fabricated to trick the Washington Post, and to use these people's suffering as a ploy for video content produces something of a chilling effect on the discourse surrounding the sexual abuse of children and decreases the chances of other real survivors of child sexual abuse being believed. James, this ethical problem has been particularly well covered by your colleagues and affiliates in conservative media, who've been very proactive in shining a spotlight on the fact that all instances of fabricated rape water down the very real societal problem of rape. So I'm surprised that you would be unaware of the ethical issues surrounding false allegations of sexual abuse. And you know, some might argue that the ethics of the situation get even worse when you consider that you literally paid Jamie Phillips to make this false sexual abuse allegation. Like, would Jamie be lying about being sexually abused at the age of 14 by Roy Moore if you hadn't asked her to go the extra mile to get you the video you need? You know, some might say that you cross an ethical line by orchestrating this situation, which not only has dubious moral implications, but also throws your own employee, Jamie Phillips, under the bus. And the final ethical dimension of the sting, which I feel I need to mention, James, is that you did it to discredit the victims of an alleged paedophile. Like, maybe he's innocent, but you don't know that. Trying to restore the public image of an alleged sexual abuser by discrediting their victims is very ethically unsound, because you could use this same tactic to restore the public image of any real rapist. In fact, this is literally what Harvey Weinstein did. He paid reporters to discredit his accusers and the journalists who were reporting their accusations. What you did is materially and morally identical to this. Being caught out for doing this is the kind of thing that would make most people, like I'm convinced 95% of people, feel deeply, deeply ashamed. It's the sort of thing that would make you rethink your priorities, or take a good hard look at yourself in the mirror and think, how the hell can I think this is acceptable journalistic conduct as a middle-aged man? But James O'Keefe experiences no moment of reflection, no remorse, no shame. No apology is made to victims of sexual abuse for exploiting their tragedy. No attempt is made to take the heat off Jamie Phillips, his employee, by confessing that the whole thing was his idea, so he should take the blame. And no apology is made to conservatives who now have one of their most prominent media figures, a close ally of the president no less, selling stories of false sexual abuse for his own petty squabbles. The path James takes is pointing the finger at other people, hurling more accusations elsewhere. My opponents are the ones who have something to hide. My opponents are the real people who should feel ashamed. Sexual abuse, just like everything else at James O'Keefe, is a chess piece to be played and rearranged in whatever way best facilitates his political and ideological goals. In the last 4 or so years of Project Veritas history, James O'Keefe has focused his efforts on investigating big tech companies in Silicon Valley. Twitter, Facebook, Google, the giants of the new media landscape whose digital platforms carry immense power over the way we process events, politics, and culture in the 21st century. This may be seen by some as something of a departure from the typical stings James usually pulls. However, more broadly, it fits the well-established pattern of James O'Keefe finding an issue that deeply resonates with populist factions of the Republican base, and then producing video footage which vindicates their anxieties. Like many of the other issues that have become ingrained in the Republican culture war since 2015, if you follow this one back to its roots, you will find President Trump. Social media was key to Trump's presidency from the very beginning, with his campaign strategy revolving around securing earned media by leveraging divisive talking points, consolidating his messaging through a distinctly personal and unfiltered Twitter account, and paying for an extremely aggressive targeted ad campaign on Facebook, shaped through data harvesting. Trump's relationship with social media is very love-hate. During his campaign and presidency, he's put out so many contradictory tweets, going from boasting about how powerful his social media is, how many people are searching his name on Google, and his great relationship with Jack Dorsey, to declaring that Jack Dorsey's company is part of a leftist big tech cabal trying to censor all conservatives. At this point, I tend to view all of Trump's rhetorical output as weaponized theatrics, words which he understands will draw out the mainstream media to roll around in the mud with him so he can come out on top. But every unverified Trump claim is also a potential Project Veritas goldmine, a chance for James O'Keefe to lean into his fanbase by legitimizing Trump's claims. Now, I'm going to analyze some of the videos Project Veritas have made about social media platforms in one big batch. Because although they discuss different platforms and key issues, James uses similar methodologies in all of the videos to lead his viewers to specific conclusions. A portion of these videos are shot in signature Project Veritas style, with snippets of conversation being shown to the viewer as proof of underlying truths about big tech's left-wing agenda. But James has also come up with a new video format where he sits down with people who used to work at Google and Facebook and listens to their stories like some sort of Oprah Winfrey character.
I have one more question, and then I'm sure there's some things that you may want to address. Right now, someone's watching this, and they're thinking, they're teetering, they're on the fence. I agree with what you're saying. I share the same values. I want to blow the whistle. That person is watching you talk and saying, I admire what he's doing, but I don't know. What is your message for that person watching?
We're going to go through the content of these Project Veritas videos on social media issue by issue, and the very first issue we'll talk about is a classic one. I don't want to labor the point about Project Veritas editing for too long because we've already rinsed it to hell and back, but in the instances where James O'Keefe uses clips from undercover recordings, it would be so useful to have the full video. Particularly during the Project Veritas Twitter investigation, it seems that a high proportion of the reporters James has sent to sting nerdy male Twitter engineers are young female reporters by the sound of their voices, and there's a kind of flirty tone to the way they speak.
Bouncer the network, so you kind of make engineering like look kind of cool.
I'm glad that you're doing that, like something needs to be done.
Putting aside the ethical implications of using women to honeypot men for these kinds of journalistic investigations, I would argue that this kind of setup risks significantly biasing the results. Particularly if James is sending in women who are pretending to be liberals who hate Trump, you're likely to produce a mirroring effect whereby, out of politeness or because they want to bang, the Twitter engineers will take their cues from the things that James's reporters are feeding them. Case in point, this engineer is asked whether he can write an algorithm to take out every single Twitter user who talks about American guns.
So like if there's like people who are like American guns, can you like write an algorithm to just take all those people out?
Oh yeah. It's actually how we do it. Yeah, it's pretty cool. You should be an engineer.
He says the girl is so smart. That's exactly what goes on at Twitter. She should become an engineer. But what she said was super fucking dumb. Can you like write an algorithm that like removes all the American gun stuff? If your response to hearing that is, you should be an engineer, you're probably lying to placate a woman in a bar. Also, look at this clip.
Because now all these smaller companies who don't have the same resources that we do will be charged with preventing the next Trump situation.
In James's Google Insider interview, he frames the Google employee's words about preventing the next Trump situation as meaning that Google wants to prevent Trump from getting re-elected. However, the employee shown in the video published a Medium post subsequently explaining that she was talking about preventing the online foreign election interference which was occurring during the 2016 presidential race. What a conundrum we're left with. The person says they meant one thing and James O'Keefe says they meant another. Here's the thing, we don't need to have a conundrum. James could show everyone the full tape and allow us to better contextualize everything that we're seeing. I also want to mention this guy from the Twitter video named Mo Nurai. Nurai talks about what Twitter might do with accounts that are pro-Trump and anti-Trump in this way that leads one to infer that he must have first-hand experience of what's been going on at Twitter while Trump's been in office. But Nurai worked at Twitter for just 3 months on a temporary contract between December 2015 and March 2016. Months before Trump even became the presumptive GOP nominee. The reason why Mona Rai is couching his language in pro-Trump, anti-Trump terms is because James O'Keefe asked his undercover reporters to pretend to be corporate directors of a tech startup company looking for engineers, and they front-loaded all their questions by saying their main concern for their platform was angry Trump supporters. They asked Mona Rai specifically how he would deal with aggressive Trump supporters who would use their platform. Once again, we're seeing James O'Keefe sending his reporters out with scripts devised to put specific words in people's mouths. If James were to publish the full unedited videos of these encounters, that would leave us with much less ambiguity about which parts were heavily contrived by the pressure of his reporters and which parts occurred more authentically. When we talk about issues affecting big tech in 2020, we're essentially talking about a multitude of different problems. Coordinated bot campaigns, misinformation, fraud of all different kinds, data safeguarding. All of these issues have led to scandals for big tech companies over the last 10 years, and have led to them taking remedial actions which have produced adverse effects for platform users. However, being a heavily political journalist, James O'Keefe is only interested in one thing: the oppression of conservatives. As such, we see every other issue being equivocated and blurred into this fairly narrow one. An example of this is James's coverage of an issue called shadow banning in his Twitter videos, which is the practice of Twitter invisibly limiting users' tweets so that they reach less people, without the user realizing what's going on. First of all, we see an engineer talking about this, but saying he doesn't think it happens at Twitter. Another engineer is asked specifically about Trump supporters and conservatives being banned. He doesn't reject the premise of the question, but by way of response, he gives a complex explanation of how filters and layers work on Twitter, never once referring to conservatives in his answer. So on the topic of shadow banning, James doesn't end up with any evidence of people saying that it works along political lines. However, James then seamlessly slips from the issue of shadow banning into the separate issue of Russian bot farms, automated accounts that were heavily pro-Trump during the 2016 election. An engineer describes the typical bots he finds on Twitter as frequently displaying American flags and crosses, and says that bots are deleted off the platform by an algorithm. But given that James has front-loaded this dialogue with the shadow banning conversation, the Project Veritas audience is now primed to conflate the practice of shadow banning with Twitter's anti-bot strategy, and looking in the comments, you can see how this plays out. Because of the way they've been primed by James's video, Project Veritas viewers come to understand that conservatives are being shadow banned for the pure reason of being conservative and having American flags in their names. This isn't what the video shows. James also misrepresents a key data protection issue in order to make his viewers believe that terrorists are treated better by Silicon Valley than Donald Trump. He highlights a conversation where a Twitter engineer says the company is happy to hand over details of Trump's tweets and messages to the Department of Justice for the investigation they were doing. And then James draws a comparison where he suggests that Apple and Twitter were keen to protect the data of the San Bernardino terrorist.
Maybe there is a subpoena from justice. But if there is, does Twitter just have to roll over and give up private information of the president? No, they don't. Just last year, the FBI asked Apple to help unlock the phone of a San Bernardino terrorist, a seemingly reasonable request. But Apple fought it. Interestingly, Twitter's CEO, Jack Dorsey, supported Apple's stand.
So, big tech companies like Apple and Twitter think it's important to safeguard the data of the San Bernardino terrorist, but contrastingly, Twitter does not think it's important to safeguard the data of the US president. The thing is, James is completely misrepresenting the FBI and Apple encryption dispute. It didn't revolve around Apple having terrorist data and not wanting to hand it over. It was data that nobody could access. The FBI were asking Apple to write new decryption software specifically to enable them to bypass security features on the smartphone. The legal battle which took place revolved around whether the FBI could legally compel Apple to do this, which would create a backdoor which could easily have been subverted by hackers as well as law enforcement agencies themselves, rendering everyone's personal data, including messages, calls, location services, phone cameras, so on and so forth, completely vulnerable.
A seemingly reasonable request.
It's really, really not. It's kind of baffling to me that James, who sees censorship on Twitter as an existential threat, would find it completely reasonable for America to drop its pants for the FBI and make everyone's data vulnerable to cyber criminals. Once again, we're seeing James purposefully equivocating issues to make conservatives feel as though they're discriminated against to such a large extent that the President of the United States has it worse than terrorists. When James published his Facebook and Google insider videos, he backed them up by leaking internal company documents from Facebook and Google, which the insiders had obtained before taking their leave. I, for one, really appreciate him doing this. That being said, the laws of social media engagement mean that for every 1,000 Project Veritas fans who watch James's videos, only a few will end up actually looking through the leaked documents. And you'd have to take my word for this. James himself addresses this specifically in his book, writing about the importance of editing videos selectively and chopping things up in whatever way will best catch his viewers' attention. He quotes Andrew Breitbart saying, "It doesn't matter if content is cannibalized, the most important thing is getting a message out there." James understands that his viewers have a low attention span. So whilst the leaked company documents represent the hard evidence for the backdoor operations of big tech, it's interesting to see which parts of the documents James chooses to prominently feature in his videos and how he represents them to his audience. Look at this clip where James and the insider talk about Facebook's policy against hate speech.
Quote, "Hate speech needs to be stopped, but there's quite a bit of content near the perimeter of hate speech that we need to address as well," unquote. What does he mean by perimeter of hate speech?
Things that aren't actually hate speech, but that might offend somebody. You know, anything that is perceived as hateful, even though no court would define it as hate speech.
The way they talk about it in the video, it sounds like the documents they have prove that Facebook is trying to ban all offensive language. However, if you look at the document they're quoting from, in the passage of text they quote, the Facebook engineer is speaking specifically about addressing content from the alt-right, and even more specifically than that, the Daily Stormer, which he explains is currently receiving a lot of attention on Facebook's news section. The Daily Stormer is a pretty well-known neo-Nazi website which displays on its front page a ticking clock counting down the time till whites in America are outnumbered by non-whites. In terms of the articles they publish, although the message is sometimes layered with irony, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a media outlet which is more explicit in spreading neo-Nazi ideology. So the way the Facebook insider summarizes the content Facebook is trying to censor,
things that aren't actually hate speech, but that might offend somebody.
that seems pretty disingenuous. Most conservatives, I'm sure, would see a difference between the debate of should Facebook censor offensive speech and should Facebook censor the type of content which treads around the perimeter of hate speech published by the Daily Stormer. So framing this discussion as if it ambiguously revolves around the former rather than the latter comes across to me as dishonest framing. Now, James might argue that his intention was actually to highlight the broader point of whether Facebook should be censoring any speech at all, to which I'd reply, okay, but then why keep the Daily Stormer out of that conversation when it was specifically referenced in the documents? Any discussion of what Facebook should or should not be censoring would inevitably have to put particular emphasis on sites like the Daily Stormer because they're the ones that test the limits of the level of offensive speech companies will allow. We also see James O'Keefe obfuscating context when he and the Facebook insider discuss Facebook's plan to tackle coordinated trolling campaigns.
I came across a document called Coordinated Trolling on Facebook. And it was this troll report where they wanted to address the problem of trolls on the platform and what they could do to combat it.
Listing flagged words such as cuck, normie, lulz, and even MSM or mainstream media, and others to identify trolls. It's clear that Facebook is targeting the language of the right and using it to actively suppress their content.
So, from watching that video, what impression do you get of Facebook's plan to tackle internet trolls? When the Facebook insider brings it up, she does little air quotes when saying the word troll, insinuating it's a misnomer. Then James highlights the words Facebook uses to identify trolls and states they are clearly targeting the language of the political right. So the Facebook insider and James O'Keefe are both pointing the viewer to the conclusion that Facebook's anti-troll efforts are just a thinly veiled attempt to silence conservatives. As you may have gathered, there's contextual information in the leaked Facebook documents which is being confusingly left out of this discussion. The list of words which were cited as being popular amongst trolls are just one piece of a more complex puzzle. Facebook's internal company documents show that the troll report pertains to the problem of coordinated trolling on Facebook. It relates to groups who gather en masse to swarm other people's Facebook pages and groups, dox and harass other platform users, mass flag videos to get them taken down by Facebook admin, and post racist memes. The words, which are typically used by groups of coordinated trolls, are named as just one part of the indicators that can be used to identify them, along with the memes they post, the groups they congregate in, and the typical behavior of the sock puppet accounts they create to troll other people with. Maybe American conservatives use these terms, but do they use these ones? Are your tits saggy outside a bra?
It's clear that Facebook is targeting the language of the right.
Just because I believe in racial supremacy, racial purity, and ethnic cleansing does not make me a neo-Nazi.
It's clear that Facebook is targeting the language of the right.
Really? That's the language of the political right, James? Interesting. At one point in the video, the Facebook insider talks to James about an algorithm which she's seen attached to the accounts of conservative pundits such as Mike Cernovich, Steven Crowder, and the Daily Caller, called Sigma Action Deboost Live Distribution, which she hasn't seen on left-wing media outlets, and so she draws the conclusion that conservative media sources are being throttled by Facebook's algorithm.
I would see it appear on several different conservative pages. I looked at the Young Turks page, I looked at Colin Kaepernick's page. None of them had received the same deboost comment.
But as the insider explains, she's not a programmer and doesn't fully understand what the algorithm does. And additionally, the only screenshots we're given in the internal documents is one of Mike Cernovich's account and one of the Young Turks account, effectively a sample size of one for each political ideology. The conclusion the insider has drawn, that Facebook is throttling conservative news feeds, seems to be massively at odds with the data we see in Facebook's top performing news posts. There's a Twitter account called Facebook's Top 10, which aggregates data to show which Facebook posts receive the most interactions every day, and each and every time, conservative news sources dominate the traffic. Every now and then there's a little left-wing news outlet sneaking in there, but the vast majority of the time it's Fox News, Dan Bongino, Ben Shapiro, Breitbart, USA Patriots for Donald Trump, Blue Lives Matter, Donald Trump 2020 voters, and yes, Steven Crowder. Real life is not aligning with the conclusions put forward by James's Facebook insider. The Facebook insider ends the video by explaining that, in their opinion, Facebook is absolutely trying to influence the outcome of the US election.
Do you think they're trying to influence elections?
Absolutely. I think, like many people, they believe that the 2016 election of Donald Trump was a fluke. It was something that shouldn't have happened.
A pretty big claim based on the limited evidence she's managed to gather. This year it came out that the Facebook insider is Cassandra Spencer, a big Trump supporter. In 2017, she posted on Gab about attending the Deplorable, an unofficial inauguration party for Donald Trump. Only 1,000 tickets were available, costing between $99 and $2,500, so only the most devoted MAGA heads got to go. Guess who else was at the Deplorable?
I'm going after the media.
When Cassandra was fired from Facebook in 2018, she was already in close contact with Project Veritas, and by the time the Facebook Insider video came out, Cassandra had been working for James O'Keefe for the best part of a year as an undercover reporter. She has, at this point, worked at Project Veritas for longer than she ever worked for Google, and at the time of recording this video, she'd been on James O'Keefe's payroll for months, with all that time to decide together what messages they wanted to convey. But James is still LARPing as Sherlock Holmes, quizzically stumbling upon hidden clues.
Do you think they're trying to influence elections?
Absolutely.
Confirmation bias is a phenomenon which has been written about in modern social psychology and refers to our tendency to interpret information and evidence in a way which supports our own personally held convictions, discounting contradictory information which doesn't align with our worldview. If you go through James's Big Tech Insider videos, you can find quite a few examples of confirmation bias doing a lot of legwork. For example, one of the underlying narratives running through James O'Keefe's Pinterest Insider video is that Pinterest is wrongfully labeling stories as misinformation or conspiracy theories when the stories are actually completely true.
So now we're talking about this AC privileged conspiracy document. What is this?
This is a document that is a partial list of conspiracies, what we recognize to be conspiracies that we need to remove from Pinterest.
Some of the things on this document are not necessarily a conspiracy, like what?
Well, the biggest thing that stood out to me was David Daleidon's videos undercover about Planned Parenthood selling baby parts.
So Pinterest considers the videotapes of Planned Parenthood workers talking to be on the same page as 9/11 being an inside job, flat Earth.
Conspiracies that we consider to be harmful to people in the real world will remove.
Harmful because it's true.
Yes.
The undercover video sting on Planned Parenthood, which James and the Insider are discussing, was released in 2015 and it was produced by David Daleidon. The videos purported to show employees at Planned Parenthood selling fetal tissue for monetary profit, and their release prompted officials in 6 different US states to conduct investigations into Planned Parenthood's activities. The tapes had all the classic hallmarks of a Project Veritas sting. Context was removed from viewers, statements were misrepresented, and the bulk of the incriminating statements were deliberately planted by David Daleidon himself to bait Planned Parenthood. At the time, David Daleidon was asked whether he would release the raw, complete videotapes to the public. He said no. If you look at the Pinterest Insider document shown here, you can see that it says that Daleidon's videos was debunked by a court ruling. One by one, the states concluded their investigations on Planned Parenthood and found that none of the ethical infringements suggested by the videos David Daleidon filmed had actually taken place. So in the light of that, I can completely understand why Pinterest would classify the video as a conspiracy theory.
Harmful because it's true.
No, harmful because it's false. The Pinterest Insider also says that Pinterest is censoring pro-life conservative viewpoints by putting an organization called Live Action onto a blocked porn list.
What is happening to liveaction.org on Pinterest?
Liveaction.org was added to a porn block list. That means that if you try to make a pin that links to liveaction.org, you won't be allowed to. The pin won't be created.
Why do you think they're targeting Live Action?
I think because Live Action is effective.
Curiously, other non-pornographic links on that list include conservative websites like PJ Media.
Live Action is not a porn site. It should not be on the porn list. Pinterest have done this because Live Action are so damn effective, says the Insider. The thing is, when you look at the Pinterest blocked porn list, you see that it has a load of websites on it which are not porn. Look at these sites at the start: blacktolive.org, blacktivist.info, donotshootus.us. These are, at first glance, racial justice activism websites, but as was discovered in 2017, they were actually part of a Russian disinformation campaign to stoke racial tensions in the US. Organic Lifestyle magazine is on the porn list. This looks like a garden variety healthy living magazine at first, but then when you dig deeper into its articles, it becomes clear that it has something of a penchant for conspiracy theories, ranging all the way from trainers weakening foot muscles to anti-vax arguments and the suggestion of natural remedies for COVID. Tracking Vaccinations is on the porn list. This is a website dedicated to graphics about how vaccines cause autism, which look like they've been designed by my dad. Zero Hedge is on the porn list. They say that Bill Gates is a messianic demon trying to implant computer chips in people through vaccinations. Neemcheck Consultative Medicine is on the porn list. This is a website of a guy who claims he can reverse autism through revolutionary treatments, but according to court notes from a trial where he was asked to testify as an expert witness, he was unable to provide any evidence for having any of the specialisms he'd claimed to have been trained in. All of these websites for sure have something in common, but it's not their conservatism or their pro-life advocacy or their effectiveness as the Pinterest Insider claimed, it's that they're all spreading misinformation. In response to Live Action, Pinterest said the organization didn't get blacklisted for pro-life content. They got blacklisted for misinformation related to conspiracies and anti-vaccination advice, something which the founder of Live Action, Lila Rose, refuted, saying Live Action does not take a position on vaccines. Let's look at this article she published. Again, this is the woman who doesn't take a position on vaccines, remember. The article is called Vaccines, Fetal Cells and the Pro-Life Moral Dilemma. This article takes one 2015 fetal tissue study by Chinese researchers and uses it as the basis of a claim that there is a moral dilemma to vaccine usage in America. Completely false, because the cell strain which the Chinese researchers created from fetal tissue, WildVax-2, is not used in vaccines. The CDC in America puts out a publication every year so Americans can see what goes into their vaccines, and WildVax-2 is nowhere to be found on the list. So with regards to Lila's tweet saying her organization doesn't take a position on vaccines, I'd say it's pretty obvious that they do take a position on vaccines. The position they take is using misinformation to frame vaccines as a moral dilemma for people who are against abortion. For me at least, this makes Live Action sit pretty nicely alongside Organic Lifestyle Magazine, Tracking Vaccinations, and Neem Check Consultative Medicine, as they are all publishing medical misinformation.
I saw this as the fight for abortion. I saw a big tech company saying quietly, saying behind closed doors that they believe that Live Action shouldn't have a platform to speak. But this is the definitive proof, and now they're in full cover-up mode as they're trying to protect their pro-abortion stances.
Both the Pinterest Insider and Lila Rose feel that this is an attempt by Pinterest to censor pro-life content. Let's see if other pro-life organizations are blocked. Pro-Life Action League? Fine. National Right to Life? Fine. Americans United for Life? Fine. American Life League? Fine. Pro-Life Across America? Fine. Alliance Defending Freedom? Fine. American Family Association? Fine. I could keep going, but at some point, I'm going to run out of pro-life organizations. The conclusion Project Veritas pushes in their Pinterest Insider video is fueled by confirmation bias. They look past the other content on the blocked porn list, content that is left-leaning, content that is kooky, so that they can declare that this is an act of oppression specifically against conservatives. In the Google Insider video, the insider explains to the Project Veritas audience how Google are rigging their autocomplete function in favor of Hillary Clinton.
What are some other things I can type here?
Hillary Clinton's emails are... It doesn't even give you a result.
Google is suggesting that people do not search for this term. Is that correct?
That's what they're saying. It's not even worth returning any results.
But people do search for this.
Absolutely, and you can tell that because you can cross-reference some of their other services.
Seems like we had a spike in October of 2016. Let's type in Donald Trump's emails. Okay.
Relative to the search term of Hillary Clinton's emails, Donald Trump's emails has no search traffic.
Now let's go back to Google.com and search for Donald Trump's emails, and it should show us no autocomplete because according to Google, no one searches for it compared to Hillary Clinton's emails. But it does. So fewer people search for this and it autocompletes, and everyone searches for Hillary Clinton's email and it doesn't.
That's right.
What's the explanation?
Well, according to them, Hillary Clinton's emails is a conspiracy theory, and it's unfair to return results based on her emails.
Now let's do our own experiment with Donald Trump. So I'm going to start by clearing my history so you know Google isn't just bringing up things I've searched before, and I'm going to enter Trump is. And look, these are the top results according to Google. Trump Israel peace agreement. So seemingly, a lot of people are looking into Trump's brilliant Israel peace plan. Now let's try something else. Let's type in, for no particular reason, Trump is a rapist, just to see if anyone searched that. And look, there's no autocomplete results. Google is telling me that nobody is searching for this. Now let's go to Google Trends, and we're gonna enter, again, for no particular reason, Trump is a rapist. And we see there's actually been quite a lot of searches for this, especially towards the end of 2016 and during summer 2020. Let's compare that to Trump-Israel peace agreement, which, remember, Google flagged as the most popular autocomplete term. And would you look at that, it's nowhere near the same volume of searches. So it looks like Google's autocomplete is protecting Donald Trump from scrutiny. What's going on here? Is Google trying to help Donald Trump get elected for a second term? If I was applying Project Veritas' level of rigor, yes. But I'm not, so no. The Wall Street Journal ran tests and found that Google's autocomplete protected political candidates on both sides of the aisle from negative descriptors, in contrast to competitors like DuckDuckGo. In terms of why this is, it's to do with loads of events taking place over the last few decades which led to Google making material changes. In 2004, Google's engineers found that whenever people searched Britney Spears' name, they were looking for porn, so the engineers blocked words of private body parts and sexual acts from being auto-generated for celebrities. In 2012, Google algorithmically mitigated the word Jew appearing whenever people searched certain politicians' names, because before that it kind of looked like there was a tinge of anti-Semitism to the autocomplete function. And in the last few years, Google has changed its algorithm to remove all sensitive and disparaging remarks from autocompleting as a blanket rule. As a result, it's really easy to use Google's autocomplete to find something to cry censorship about. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Black Lives Matter, the police, literally take your pick. It really isn't a good barometer of Google's political opinions. The Insider uses the autocomplete function as their basis for decrying political censorship at Google, but only explores how this affects Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump. Their confirmation bias leads them down a very narrow interpretation of what's actually going on. Thus far, my critique of the Big Tech Insider videos has centered on the way that James's feature presentations tend towards a selective and misrepresentative view of the leaked documents, rather than the credibility of the insiders themselves. However, it's notable that in each and every scenario we've talked through, it is the insiders themselves, not James, who extrapolate bad faith interpretations of the evidence on hand. It makes you wonder about whether there's more to the insider stories that's not being made clear in the interviews. As already discussed, the Facebook insider was someone who worked at Facebook for less than a year on a contract, and in that short space of time started gathering documents for James. The Pinterest insider, since being fired from Pinterest, now works for James full-time at Project Veritas HQ. And the Google insider, Zach Voorhees, is the one out of the three who has the biggest social media presence, and thus is the one whose worldview and perspectives have become the most clearly elucidated since he initially spoke with James. Not too long after James published his interview with Zach Voorhees, an article came out in the Daily Beast which remarked a lot of Zach's tweets appeared to play into far-right conspiracy theories, including remarks that 9/11 was planned by Israel and a Zionist cabal, and tweets using the triple parentheses when talking about the globalist media, a dog whistle commonly used by the far-right to signal entities which they believe to be secretly controlled by Jews. James O'Keefe responded scathingly, affirming, "Not every source is a perfect angel," and the reason the reporter was attacking James's source was that that reporter worked at a woke clickbait farm website, whose incentive was anathema to informing citizens in a democracy. So James is saying that this journalist is a hack because his work revolves around wielding racism as a weapon to discredit people. Let's jog our memories about some of James's past work. He burst onto the scene in 2009 when he accused Planned Parenthood of being racist because they accepted donations from him when he was pretending to be racist. In his book, James boasts about the amount of views he got on his videos, showing Planned Parenthood in all its racist glory. The next year, James published a video of a teachers union member saying the N-word. He then got his black friend to call up the school pretending to be a worried parent to show his audience that the school defended racist teachers. In James's NPR sting, he got his undercover reporter to start a conversation about the Jews controlling all the newspapers and broadcast clips of NPR not challenging the narrative to insinuate that NPR was anti-Semitic. In his book, James writes about how he coached his reporters to bait NPR. You almost had the NPR exec agree with you when you told him that Jews control the media. All you had to do was to stop talking and let him talk. Throughout the whole time that James was using rhetorical traps to frame people as racists and anti-Semites, he was defending his journalism exposing racism as an important service to the American people. It was important for Americans to know who was racist in these liberal organizations, who was anti-Semitic, all this stuff. And yet now that his own source's anti-Semitism is being brought to light, suddenly calling out anti-Semitism is complete bullshit. It's antithetical to what journalists should be doing. Anyway, I think it actually is relevant to look at some of Zach Voorhees' broader perspectives when evaluating the information he presents in his Project Veritas video, and the reason for this will soon become clear. In his appearances with Project Veritas, Zach comes across as very rational, very measured. He's emotional at points, but it just comes across as him being passionate about wanting Google to right their wrongs, and this is what makes his testimony more believable. He does not at all come across as someone who would be spreading conspiracy theories about 9/11. But then, when Zach appeared with Alex Jones on InfoWars and was allowed to speak unencumbered, he gave off a very different impression. First of all, Zach recommends a book to InfoWars viewers.
So, I actually want to recommend a book called SJWs Always Lie by Vox Day.
Yeah.
That's the only book that I would recommend. The thing is that, get this book, SJWs Always Lie by Vox Day, and read it. It's a fascinating read, and it goes by really quickly.
Vox Day is a self-proclaimed ethno-nationalist who writes a blog and publishes books about the American culture war. The book Zach Voorhees is recommending, SJWs Always Lie, is a book which Vox Day wrote in order to point out the danger SJWs pose to Western society. It psychoanalyzes SJWs for 300 pages, giving readers advice on how to argue with them and combat their villainy. The book becomes particularly relevant to Zach Vorhies' Project Veritas interview when you consider the references Zach makes to SJWs, or social justice warriors, when speaking to James.
They're training the AI now with with a bunch of humans that you consider them social justice warriors or whatever you want to label them. They've got no interest in fixing things that go against their social justice narrative.
Listen to the way that SJWs are described in Vox Day's book, and bear in mind that this is, in real life, how Zach perceives his former co-workers at Google. The SJWs have been observed to possess smaller amygdalas and less developed brain structures. You are never safe in the vicinity of SJWs. Attempting to accommodate them will make you more vulnerable to their attacks. SJWs always prefer to ambush an unsuspecting target who does not realize that he is vulnerable. This is not the time for Christian forgiveness, because these are people who are trying to destroy you and are quite willing to harm your family and your children in the process. Homeschooling of children is necessary to remove millions of children from the SJW brainwashing factories known as public schools, even though children will still receive a barrage of SJW propaganda from Disney and Nickelodeon.
It's a fascinating read, and it goes by really quickly.
This book, yeah, super nutty, crazy in the coconut. It establishes SJWs as predatory mega villains that will kill you unless you manage to kill them first. Not the sort of book that any sane person would think about using as a tactical operations manual.
Yeah, so I followed this book basically as a tactical operation manual on how I was going to leak this information.
Seriously, Zach, what the hell? Some of the advice the book gives is straight up sociopathic. Once you've discovered that a co-worker or an employee belongs to a political party that indicates SJW sympathies, arrange to have him jettisoned at the earliest possible opportunity. If you have any SJWs working under you, fire them. If you have an SJW relying on you for something, play dumb and assure him he'll get it done on time, then fail to deliver, all the while promising that it's going to be done next week. Target the enemy at every opportunity, hit them wherever they show themselves vulnerable, play as dirty as your conscience will commit, undermine them, sabotage them, and discredit them. Be ruthless and show them absolutely no mercy. You don't need to take any sadistic pleasure in hunting SJWs, although you may well develop a taste for it, but you do need to do it in self-defense of your own career. If Zach is using this as a tactical operations manual, I think it's safe to say he has something of a personal vendetta against people he perceives as SJWs. I can tell you that in Project Veritas's Google document dump, there are so many files which are just straight up doxes of a lot of the former colleagues Zach used to have at Google, showing their personal Facebook pages, their LinkedIn profiles, their emails to each other. There's a nastiness to the process which Project Veritas have facilitated here, allowing Zach to publicly take his vengeance on colleagues he didn't like. And Zach has loads of theories about what's going on at Google behind the scenes. He brings up the Tavistock conspiracy theory.
I want to ask a question to the audience. Who is the Tavistock Institute, and what did they have to do with the Beatles? And when you look at their involvement, what you'll see is that a lot of these, what we thought were organic cultural movements, were actually designed by social engineers to capture the youth of America.
I've done a whole video on the Tavistock theory. It's the idea that an elite Illuminati-style group worked together with the CIA to brainwash Western society, and the Beatles are paid actors whose music is written by Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School, and it's all constructed to make us embrace rock and roll instead of family values and become leftist SJWs. The whole thing is pretty mad. You can watch my video if you want to see that conspiracy theory further explained and criticized. Zach also has theories about powerful institutions destroying cultural leaders who go against their establishment narratives.
A lot of the cultural heroes that we have end up dying, before their time. Anyone who breaks free comes under danger. Like, look at Ye. Like, he went, off script and started, supporting Donald Trump and trying to wake up the masses, saying the whole system is lying.
They tried to put him in a mental institution.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh, he's in a mental institution. That's all you heard about it. And then you look in to what he was really saying, and you're like, oh no, he wasn't crazy. he was just going off script and going against the manufactured narrative that's being pumped into the minds of Americans.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves over the last 4 years has been listening to people who've quite clearly only taken an interest in Kanye for his political stances, formulate these lionizing narratives around him, whilst being completely clueless about his personal history as an artist. Throughout My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Yeezus, and Life of Pablo albums released before Donald Trump was a political entity, the public saw Kanye West experiencing manic highs and depressive lows constantly. This has been happening since 2010. Interviews where Kanye would be asked a question and his mind would suddenly shoot off in a random direction and you'd see hostility burst out of nowhere, or Kanye getting lost in a state of euphoria when trying to work out what he was trying to say. And Kanye's bizarre behavioral episodes happened with such consistency that people were speculating about Kanye's mental well-being from the very start. When Kanye was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it didn't come as some revelatory shock that nobody saw coming. It was a medical rationalization of the erratic behavior we'd all been seeing from Kanye for the last 10 years that made total sense. However, for people like Zach Voorhees, coming up against inconvenient facts like Kanye West's bipolar diagnosis contradicts their belief that Kanye, in supporting Donald Trump, must be a logical teller of hard truths. So what they end up doing is reinterpreting reality so that it coincides with their own worldview. Thus, we get to the conclusion that Kanye was not actually hospitalized for his poor mental health. He was eliminated by the deep state for supporting Donald Trump. And this reinterpretation of reality gets to the core of the problem with James O'Keefe's interview with Zach Voorhees. Of course, Zach thinks Google is trying to rig the election against Donald Trump. Of course, Zach thinks all his former colleagues at Google were SJWs. Of course, Zach thinks Google are trying to socially engineer a new society through mind control. It fits perfectly with the way he views everything. By the way, he's back on the map this year, promoting COVID conspiracy videos. It's my contention that James O'Keefe couldn't have met and spoke to Zach Voorhees without knowing that a lot of the things Zach was saying were based on delusions. But rather than doing what any other journalist would have done and simply releasing the internal Google documents to allow everyone to form their own conclusions, James capitalized on the opportunity to give Zach Voorhees a platform for his narratives about Google being overrun by SJWs. Also, James could create his own powerful Project Veritas narrative. And this is what we see reflected across the whole suite of Big Tech Insider videos. Each video purports to build on the expertise of neutral insiders to explain the leaked documents, but instead, we see those insiders mischaracterizing the documents, obfuscating context, and advancing selective interpretations to lead Project Veritas viewers to conclusions which are completely unsubstantiated. Despite the way the insiders are presented as a neutral foil to James O'Keefe's partisanship, a deeper look into them reveals they are just as blinded by partisanship, if not more so, than him. The Facebook insider talking to us about the wrongful censorship of extremists is a person who supports the Proud Boys. The Pinterest insider talking to us about the censorship of pro-life content is a self-proclaimed abortion abolitionist. The Google insider talking to us about Google being behind a conspiracy to rig the election is a conspiracy theorist who thinks the Beatles were a psyop. These are not the people you should be going to for a level-headed analysis of the things they're trying to discuss. But on the other hand, James's Big Tech Insider videos do highlight an important issue. If Google, Facebook, and Twitter insist on not being transparent about how exactly they rationalize their information ranking, censorship, and the practical functioning of their platforms, they leave a big gap for dishonest ideologues like James O'Keefe and his insiders to rush into. Where there is no clear explanation given for how these companies work behind the scenes, there will always be polemicists ready to provide one which advances their own goals and their own agenda, and James O'Keefe is more than happy to facilitate this process for as long as it brings a political benefit to the Republican Party. In this video, we got ourselves up to speed on the key events of recent Project Veritas history, having a look at the types of operations James has been pursuing in the era of the Trump administration. At the start of the video, we saw just how far James was willing to go to help Republicans get elected in Senate races, paying women to lie about sexual abuse in order to discredit female accusers of the people James O'Keefe wants to see in power. We then moved on to an analysis of the Big Tech Insider videos which James started filming in 2019, and went on to some criticisms of the way James used the video interview format to decontextualize evidence, establish dichotomies based on false premises, and capitalize on the hyperbole of unreliable narrators to sell his audience powerful emotional narratives about Big Tech's hyper left-wing agenda. The purpose of this series on Project Veritas as a whole was to narrate their trajectory throughout 10 years of operations. If you've been here since part 1, you've now received an extremely detailed overview of James O'Keefe's key pursuits between 2009 and 2019, from him being a young conservative activist trying to change campus culture at Rutgers University, to him being a paid propaganda machine for the Republican Party establishment. The internet media landscape that Project Veritas stepped into in 2010 held a lot of promise for journalism. It was a space where, ostensibly, the more principled independent reporters had every chance of rising to the top and cutting through the subterfuge of their mainstream media counterparts. However, the journey of Project Veritas paints a much more grim and cynical picture. Project Veritas managed to succeed in this space not by committing themselves to principles, but rather by tying their brand to an unrelenting, uncompromising political ideology, and engineering situations which placated the ideology's most emotional followers. They unshackled themselves from the burdens of due diligence and oversight which paralyzed their competitors, and profited from widening the divisions of an already polarized nation. What exactly lies in the future of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas is hard to say for sure, but given that James O'Keefe has gone from supporting George Bush and the US imperialism of the 2000s, to the conservative elitism of Mitt Romney in 2012, to the anti-elitist populism of Donald Trump in 2016, it seems clear that wherever the Republican Party goes, James O'Keefe will obediently follow, manufacturing reality according to their Manichean vision of the world. Yes, safe gang. Thanks so much for watching this video, I really appreciate it. Rolling down the screen right now are my Patreon gang, sick bunch of folks who have my undying love and gratitude. If you enjoy my vids, consider becoming one of them. Also, shout out Mad Blender. I approached her completely out of the blue because I thought she would nail some voiceover parts I needed for the Jamie Phillips section of this video, and I have never been more correct. I'll include links to her YouTube channel in the description, go check her out. I have to admit that when I started making this series, as usual, I never intended for it to go on this long, but as I got into the weeds of Project Veritas, I realized that if I was to give an all-encompassing view of James O'Keefe and the organization, the only way I was going to do it was to cover a vast breadth of their operations. Years of videos, each with their own background context, legal investigations, analyses, and so forth. So that's how we've ended up with like 6 hours of content. There was another video about our boy James I wanted to make, but you know what? We're coming to the end of 2020. I'm vibing off the fact that Trump's been voted out of office. I'm vibing off the fact that a COVID vaccine's on the way. I'm feeling a lot of optimism and positivity recently. And so for the next video or two on my channel, I want to talk about some subjects related to music and shit that make me happy rather than sad. So that's what you can expect early in 2021. We'll get back to the right-wing media figures, of course, at some point next year. And I know there is one popular beanie-wearing legend that everyone wants me to make a series about. That will happen. It's just going to take a lot of YouTube video watching in advance. So bear with me. Other than that, I hope everyone's good. I'll be back with video content as soon as I can. Gonna say bye now. Bye.